Okay, step 1, seat clamp disassembly. Unthread the rear clamp bolt using your 5mm hex key. Remove the clamp nut and upper clamp. You can then remove your saddle and the lower clamp. Clean everything and put it aside until the end of the service. Step 2, partially compressed dropper. Compress the dropper by hand halfway through its stroke. Step 3, unthread actuator from the lower tube. Using your 14mm wrench, unthread the actuator. Step 4, removing cartridge from the upper tube. With the seat clamps removed, the top of the cartridge will be exposed. Using your 5mm hex key, unthread the cartridge in the direction of the arrow. Step 5, remove actuator from cartridge. Now that the cartridge is free from the upper and lower tubes, unthread and remove both lock bolts from the side of the actuator using your 2mm hex key. Once the lock bolts are removed, you can slide the actuator off the cartridge. Step 6, unthread MIDCAP assembly. Gripping the collar by hand with a strap wrench or soft jaw pliers, unthread the MIDCAP counterclockwise. Once it's unthreaded, slide the MIDCAP up the upper tube. Step 7, remove lower tube. Slide the lower tube down and off the upper tube. Step 8, remove pins. While you're removing the pins, note their orientation in the post. There are 4 brass guide pins and 2 polymer guide pins. 3 brass pins are oriented at the front of the post, and 1 brass pin directly at the rear. The 2 polymer pins sit on either side of the rearward brass pin. There are 6 lower channels for guide pins and 5 upper channels for travel adjustment pins. Using your pick tool, remove all the guide pins from the upper tube. Wipe the grease and grit off of each pin. Step 9, remove bushings and MIDCAP assembly. Both the upper and lower bushings are split, so you can pop them off by hand and slide them off the upper tube. Wipe any old grease and grit off of both bushings. Once all the guide pins and both bushings are removed, you can slide the MIDCAP assembly down and off the upper tube. Step 10, clean and assess internals. Using isopropyl alcohol, clean and wipe down both upper and lower tubes. This is a great time to assess the tubes, bushings, and pins for any damage or excess wear. Step 11, install MIDCAP assembly. Apply some grease within the dust wiper and on the DU bushings inside the MIDCAP assembly. Slide the MIDCAP onto the upper tube, ensuring the dust wiper is sitting correctly and not rolling in on itself. Slide it all the way up past the pin channels to roughly mid-travel on the upper tube. Step 12, grease upper tube. Using your light suspension grease, grease the upper tube around the guide pin channels and where the lower bushing will sit. Some grease in the channels is okay and can help hold the pins in place during assembly, but avoid filling them completely with grease. Step 13, install bushings. Completely coat both the upper and lower bushings with grease and reinstall them onto the post. Slide your upper bushing up past the guide pin channels, but below the MIDCAP assembly. Step 14, reinstall guide pins. Remembering the orientation from when you removed them, reinstall the guide pins into the 6 lower channels. And if you need to, reinstall either the 5 or 10 travel shims into the 5 upper channels. Step 15, reinstall lower tube. With all the internals back in place, you can now slide the lower tube back onto the upper tube. Be sure to orient the OneUp logo directly forward so that the vertically lasered OneUp components is directly rearward. Step 16, MIDCAP assembly. With the upper bushing fully seated, you can now slide the MIDCAP down and thread it onto the lower tube by hand. Step 17, install actuator onto cartridge. Using your 2mm hex key, thread both lock bolts into the actuator and tighten to 2 Newton meters. Step 18, thread cartridge into upper tube. Slide the cartridge back into the dropper until you can see the top threaded portion of the cartridge through the upper tube. Using your 5mm hex key, thread the cartridge clockwise up and into the upper tube and tighten to 3 Newton meters. Step 19, thread actuator onto lower tube. Ensuring the post is still compressed halfway, thread the actuator onto the lower tube and tighten to 3 Newton meters using your 14mm crescent wrench. Step 20, seat clamp assembly. Place the lower clamp into the cradle of the upper tube, making sure the arrow is pointing forward. Take the upper clamp and your saddle rails with its arrow forward on top of the lower clamp and slip it under the front clamp nut. You can then drop the rear clamp nut into its seat at the back of the upper clamp. Thread the rear clamp bolt into the nut and tighten to 8 Newton meters. Step 21, reinstall a post on the bike.